The absence of the Democratic Republic of Congo is regrettable and is also incomprehensible. To put an end to human suffering, Congolese leaders should take this humanitarian crisis seriously.
Well, it was a conference to help raise funds for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The UN says the Central African country needs at least $1.7 billion this year to tackle the humanitarian crisis. And around 100 delegates got the ball rolling, raising more than $500 million in Geneva. But one notable absentee was the DRC itself. The government boycotted the event, accusing the United Nations of exaggerating the humanitarian crisis. Now, according to the Kinshasa government, only 230,000 people have been displaced. That's a far cry from the UN estimate of 4.5 million displaced people in the country. Well, to help us better understand what's happening, I'm joined from Leicester in the UK by Michael Shibangu. He is the president of the Association for Development and Democracy in Congo. And in Brussels, we have former aid worker Chris Parvuz. He is the author of Congo's Violent Peace, Conflict, and Struggle Since the Great African War. Thanks both so much for joining us. Michael, let me begin with you. Did the DRC lose out by not participating in this donors conference, or did the government make a point that needed to be made?
Well, I think the people of DRC lose out. I think it's important to understand that we have a government that does not care about the people. This explains this callous attitude. The people of DRC will lose out because we have millions of people who are internally displaced, people who are in dire need of help, and they needed international assistance. And the fact that the government boycotted it is actually very deplorable, very disappointing. So the people that will suffer, not the government that. Not the government of DRC that is actually, we have a president who's actually out of term and is trying to sweep this under the carpet because he feels that the situation does not portray his leadership well. Okay.
Chris, are you on the same page?
Well, yes, of course, the situation at the ground is extremely complex, and that has to do with the uncertainties around the immediate political future, let's say, of Congo. It is not clear where we're going to in terms of the electoral process, and this has an impact on local tensions and local conflicts.
Now, both of you have portrayed this as almost a question of President Joseph Kabila's ego and his government's ego and not wanting to really expose the Democratic Republic of the Congo for the crisis that it harbors at the moment, and that innocent people will suffer as a result of that. But Michael, there's a bigger issue at play here, and other African countries have complained about the same. And this is the point that the DRC government is making, that the United Nations and the NGOs exaggerate humanitarian crises across Africa so that they can justify their funding, they can raise more money for their own means, while they cripple the DRC's efforts and other African countries' efforts to try and attract foreign investors. And it keeps African countries dependent on aid from foreign powers. Do you see any truth to that?
I think it's just a way of avoiding to deal with the real situation. If there is a crisis in DRC, it is because the government of DRC has failed its people. It's because we have a leader who has been in power for 17 years. And despite the fact that he's been in power for 17 years, he has not been able to provide the security for his people. There are crises. And you see the humanitarian situation on the ground is not only getting worse, but it's also spreading geographically. I think that the core issue here is one of leadership. Whilst a case can be made to say that perhaps the funds aimed at people who are suffering should be better managed, but that in it all does not excuse the real issue, the real problem, which is a government that is not doing well, and not a government that is also very corrupt. We have an issue of corruption. We have a leader that is out of term and refuses to go. This further exacerbates the situation on the ground. Things are getting worse. You have people trying to rise up, protesting.
Michael, let me phrase it this way then. I mean, in your opinion, do these European powers, for example, involved in this conference, do they only want to do right by the Democratic Republic of Congo? Are their interests purely humanitarian, almost altruistic in a sense?
Well, there might be some political interests at stake, but I think it's important that we don't forget that the people who are suffering are in need of help. Whilst I agree that there's a need to manage better the fund that I am to support the people so that the people on the ground will benefit more, this, however, does not excuse the real issue, the cause of the problem. So you have there's an effect and the cause. The cause is the poor leadership of many African leaders, particularly the leader of DRC. If they manage better the country, then there would be a need. There wouldn't be this need to raise funds and to support people. The government, like any other responsible government, will be able to manage the situation on its own without the need for international help, without the need for international aid.
Okay, let me get Chris's take on this then. I mean, the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo has complained that NGOs and the United Nations, in a sense, have this perverse interest in exaggerating the crisis in the DRC, because that way they get more funding, they can sustain their employees, as long as they continue to justify that a need is there. So it is a selfish interest of these NGOs and the United Nations to say that this crisis is much bigger than it is. Other African countries have complained about the same thing. I'm wondering if you think that they have a point.
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand that the Democratic Republic of Congo at this point is in a very difficult dialogue with the international community and on different issues, and most of all on the forthcoming elections and how they have to be organized. And I think the main point is that the DRC, the government of the DRC, absolutely wants to keep the steering wheel of the different processes in their own hands. So they are, to a certain extent, reluctant of a wave of humanitarian aid taking shape without them being very involved. So that's why they have been insisting on a more active and more visible place. But when we talk about humanitarian crisis, I have the tendency to believe, I think that the government is presenting a picture which is below the reality, that the reality is more serious than the government wants us to believe. The government seems to have a difficulty to admit that situation on the ground in the field is slipping out of their hands.
Okay, but Michael, I mean, I have to bring this back to this very sensitive issue here, and that perhaps there is corruption within Joseph Kabila's government. We'll move on to some other issues as well that he has been trying, he says, to crack down on that corruption. But in the meantime, he says that this aid that is almost being forced on the DRC actually hinders the development of private industry and foreign investment. Now, just speak as a Congolese yourself. Does that concern you? Is there an issue here with development, private sector development being hindered because of a dependence on aid?
Absolutely not. The one thing that is hindering private development in DRC is the corrupt government that we have. The government that is actually making it hard for businesses to operate freely. When you get to DRC, you have to pay bribes here and there. So many people are finding it very difficult to do business in DRC. They are having to move to a country where they can actually do business easily. And on top of that, you also have the instability that is linked to the political process where the government does not want to go. As a result, the attention on the street. We've seen the government cracking down on protesters, killing protesters. This, of course, if you are an investor, you would be very wary in terms of investing in a country where there is political instability.
But we're hearing out of the DRC just today, actually, that you say they're cracking down on protests, but they say they're actually cracking down on corruption. And in that process, Joseph Kabila has just fired some 256 judges for not, first of all, even having law degrees or having charges of corruption filed against them. Do you see that at least as a positive step toward trying to rid corruption in the DRC?
Well, I think it's just something that he's doing to trying to improve his image. Who appointed those judges without law degree? Is the same person that then appointed them, and now after a while he decided that they didn't have law degree. If you appoint people without law degrees, then it means yourself you're incompetent, because you're supposed to check those things. Those people have worked for years. People have been sentenced by those judges who were not legally qualified to work as judges, and to do that now, and again, it just shows that he is not in control of the situation, and he himself is now part of the problem. Whilst sacking those judges is a good thing, but it also shows that there is a serious problem that Kabila has been letting, that is not managing well, and those problems have consequences, not only for the Congolese people themselves, but also for businesses. When you have those judges that do not, that are corrupt, where those judges that do not have the legal qualification, the necessary qualification to work in the industry, they will take bad decisions, and people will be affected. And again, it just highlights the problem that we have in DRC, which is systematic, a system that needs to be totally reformed. Otherwise, we'll continue to have the problem that we have. The humanitarian situation will get worse. So we need to sort out this question of leadership.
Okay, Chris, just a final question to you. I mean, what needs to be done in the immediate term to help the millions of people you say are affected by this humanitarian crisis in the DRC?
I think the DRC has, for generations, a governance problem. And this governance problem can only find a start of a solution if we come to free and fair elections in the short run and before the end of the year, and that political change can take shape.
Okay.
At this moment, the government is very unpopular because of the bad governance.
Just a final thought. I mean, free and fair elections are only helpful if they can have good candidates running on the tickets. I'd like to thank both of you so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers.